Pat, we've carefully monitored your 700 Club for 4 years now. You say many good and worthwhile things, but you also make statements and urge political actions that trouble a lot of us. Because you've not been willing to meet to discuss these matters, I've prepared this short videotape, hopefully to begin a discussion between us and among all people who care about the truth and who are concerned about the growing spirit of intolerance in this land. Let's start with this 700 Club news report.
And all the Christmas trees at New York's Grand Central Station have been removed after complaints from Muslims. The National Council on Islamic Affairs objected to a mostly secular display at the busy terminal, which included trees, wreaths, lights, and menorahs. The group said symbols of the Islamic faith should have been displayed too. But rather than add Muslim decorations to the already diverse display, Metro-North Railroad, which operates the station, decided to remove all the symbols of Christmas and Hanukkah. The spokesman for the Islamic organization told the Hearst newspapers, "We are simply asking for equal rights. America is no longer a Judeo-Christian society."
That Christmas event was reported fairly on December 19, 1995. But listen to the way you used the story in your commentary that followed immediately.
These Muslims are saying what, of course, the liberals in our society want. They want to do away with the Judeo-Christian traditions of America. They want to take away Christmas. They want to take away Hanukkah. They want to take away all of our symbols of our faith.
It isn't true, Pat. Muslim Americans don't want to do away with our Christian or our Jewish traditions. Why would you say that? I called the man who wrote the station master, Dr. Mohammed Mehdi, the Secretary General of the National Council on Islamic Affairs. He's a Muslim American with a PhD in constitutional law from UC Berkeley. He wrote me back. He said, "We do not want to take away the traditions or the symbols of the Christian or the Jewish faith. We just wanted our crescent and star, the symbol of 10 million loyal Muslim Americans, to be included in that very public place during that joyous holiday season." Instead of finding out the truth, Dr. Mehdi says, Mr. Robertson simply used the unfortunate incident to support his own prejudice against Muslim Americans. For some reason, Pat, you didn't tell the truth. You invented a Muslim American conspiracy to do away with Christmas and Hanukkah. But worse, you went even farther, raising dangerous and totally unfounded fears in the minds of your viewers. Listen.
You go to the Saudi Arabia, baby, and you see how much Christianity. You can't build a church or a house above a mosque. If you say anything against the Holy Quran, they put a contract on you, i.e. Salman Rushdie, i.e. and let's face it, I mean, and we want to bring that here to America. We want to have the Muammar Gaddafis, the Ayatollah Khomeinis, and the oppressive. We want to do Sharia, where they cut the hands off of thieves and behead adulterers. Boy, if they started beheading adulterers in America, we would have a whole lot lower population we've got now. you approve? You want Sharia?
Well, you wouldn't know half your friends.
I mean, they do look different if they. I mean,
noticeably.
Seriously, is that the kind of thing we want, or are we going to buckle under the? I mean, this is not an Islamic country.
Pat, you didn't even have your facts right. Ancient Muslim law dictates that adulterers should be stoned to death, not beheaded, exactly as stated in the Old Testament laws of Moses. Why would you imply quite falsely that Muslim Americans would return to these brutal standards, any more than Jewish or Christian Americans would want to return to the equally brutal standards of Leviticus in the Old Testament? Why would you accuse Muslim Americans, again quite falsely, of supporting Gaddafi or Khomeini, when in fact millions of them came here, as your ancestors came, to escape such oppressive regimes? Did you mean to create suspicion and fear between your viewers and our Muslim American neighbors? Isn't that breaking one of the 10 Commandments when you bear false witness against a neighbor? Aren't you also breaking Jesus' great commandment, love God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself? I'm afraid, Pat, that so much of your intolerance flows out of your equally false and dangerous idea that we are a Christian nation that should be ruled exclusively by Christians on values taken from the Bible as you interpret it.
Now, this country was founded by Christians. It was founded as a Christian nation. There is no question in the first 150 or so years of the history of this nation, it was considered a Christian nation.
But Pat, we weren't even a nation, let alone a Christian nation during those first 150 years. We were 13 very different colonies, and though most settlers had Christian roots, even in New England there was only one church member to every 8 settlers. It's true that early in the 1600s, Anglican leaders in Virginia and the Puritans in Massachusetts saw themselves as the agents of Christ come to the New World to set up a new Christian Israel. And in his name they established state churches that ruled over the religious and the civil lives of believers and non-believers alike. But what you don't say is that during those same Christian years, a new tyranny replaced the old. Only members of the state churches could hold office or even vote, but everyone was taxed to pay for pastors and for church property. And those who disagreed with teachers of the established churches, even fellow Christians, were often forced to flee the state or face trial and even hanging. Pat, I'm a Christian. I would love for our nation to reflect the Spirit of Christ, but I love democracy. I don't want to live in a Christian nation, a theocracy ruled exclusively by Christians as those first colonies were. Apparently you do. Isn't that what you mean when you argue so strongly against the separation of church and state?
They've been trying to sell us this nonsense about separation of church and state, and that's what it is. It is a fanatical interpretation of the First Amendment.
Pat, please look at the First Amendment again, or read Article 6 of our Constitution. Separation of church and state is at the very heart of this great democracy. It makes it safe for all of us to believe or not to believe freely. In his autobiography, Thomas Jefferson explains the intent of our forefathers to include within the mantle of protection, quote, the Jew and the Gentile, the Christians and the Muslims, the Hindu and the infidel of every denomination. Is your long-range goal, Pat, to replace the Constitution with biblical law? While you are warning falsely about a Muslim American return to the cruel punishments of Sharia, are you taking this nation back to the cruel punishments of Leviticus? Where will all this lead, Pat? Where are you taking us?
We're going to win this battle, but we've got to stand together. All the Christians in America need to join hands together and say, we've had enough of this utter nonsense. We're not going to allow religious cleansing to take place in America like it is in the Sudan.
Religious cleansing in America? Pat, I did a book-film project on cultic behavior in Jonestown. Your words sound ominously like Jim Jones or David Koresh. They use words like that to create fear and intolerance in the hearts of their followers. They put almost anyone who disagreed with them on their enemy list. I have to confess, at first I thought that homosexuals were the only ones on your enemy list, Pat. But after monitoring the 700 Club, I discovered that you tend to demean and to demonize almost everyone who disagrees with you.
People for the American way. They want to stifle free speech. That's American. They want anti-Christian bigotry. Is that American? They don't want children to be allowed to pray or privately themselves or read the Bible in schools. That's American. And they want to slaughter unborn babies. That's American. That isn't the American way. That's a fascist way. Terrible heartache is being visited upon homes by the spread of homosexuality. The motives behind the UN Conference for Women have lethal implications about the spread of homosexuality throughout the world. Did you see the article published by Planned Parenthood that we must encourage more homosexuality in order to cut down on population growth? The concept is outcomes-based, and in other words, children do not get promoted in school unless they show the proper outcome, which has to do with their tolerance of homosexuals or their belief toward minorities. The ACLU, as usual, distorts the truth. They never tell the truth. They just don't know what it is.
Pat, please hear yourself. Trashing fellow Americans by distorting their positions and questioning their sincerity. When was the last time you sat down to dialogue with anyone who disagrees with you? You're a hard man to see, Pat. But the soul force principles of Jesus, Gandhi, and King say that I can't give up on you. So here we go again. I'm hoping that this short video is helping you understand the issues I want desperately to discuss, especially those issues that concern my lesbian sisters and my gay brothers, like homosexuality in the Bible.
The Bible says that it is an abomination for a man to lie with a man as with a woman, or a woman to lie with a woman as with a man.
Pat, you know that Leviticus 18 or 20 only mention men. Why did you add women to it? It's bad enough that you constantly condemn us with the ancient holiness codes, even after Jesus and Paul both said clearly that they don't apply to us anymore. But you're changing the Bible, Pat. You're rewriting it just so that you can condemn lesbians along with gay men. It shows how careless one can become when using Scripture. Besides adding to the text, you also leave something out of it. You say a man who sleeps with another man is an abomination, but you never go on to complete the verse, and should be killed. Some of your friends and supporters take the whole verse seriously and think we should be executed. What is your ultimate goal for lesbians and gay Americans, Pat? Should we be afraid?
The Bible says that because of certain abominations, such as homosexuality, a land will vomit out its inhabitants.
You love to use the vomit line from Leviticus 18, don't you? To support your notion that earthquakes in California and floods on the Mississippi are God's punishment on America for tolerating homosexuality. And yet you never mention the list of other reasons given in that same chapter for a land to vomit out its inhabitants, including seeing your granddaughter naked or using God as a swear word. In seminary, we call this proof texting, Pat, misusing the Bible to make a point we want to make, instead of teaching people what the Bible really says.
The Apostle Paul called homosexuality shameful, the result of being given up by God to what he called vile passions.
No, he didn't. The Apostle Paul never used the word homosexuality, not once. There wasn't even a word for it in Greek or in Old Testament Hebrew. Pat, you mislead your followers when you quote from the Bible outside of its historic and linguistic context. On his missionary journeys, Paul was sickened by what he saw in the temples of Isis and Diana, but it had nothing to do with the love we gays and lesbians feel for each other. And the irresponsible and unloving sexual behaviors that the Bible does condemn clearly, gang rape, temple prostitution, pedophilia, they're all condemned by every responsible gay man or lesbian. Why don't you talk to a scholar from the Christian or Jewish traditions who can show your viewers how the biblical authors know nothing and say nothing about homosexual orientation as we understand it today? Doesn't the total silence about this issue by the prophets and the disciples, and even Jesus, make you wonder sometimes about your obsession to condemn us? And your handling of the scientific evidence seems as irresponsible and as uncaring as your misuse of Scripture.
I just think this genetic answer is essentially a lie. I just think it is a lie. You know, there may be a tiny fraction of homosexuals who have some genetic disorder. If homosexuality were genetic, such as gender or race, then it could not be changed. But apparently thousands of men and women can testify to the opposite. Yesterday we showed you the latest scientific findings which dispel the myth that homosexuals are born gay.
There are no scientific studies that prove homosexuals are not born gay. And there are hundreds of studies, more and more every day, that lead scientists to believe we are. Our sexual orientation, like yours, Pat, is just another human characteristic. Like the color of your eyes or the shape of your hands, it is another of our Creator's mysterious, wonderful gifts to be embraced and celebrated and lived with integrity. The American Psychological Association says it is no more abnormal to be homosexual than to be left-handed. But you go on using your experts to support your already discredited case.
The dynamics of homosexuality are based on the disturbed family structure, what I call the homosexogenic family structure. The abdicating father, the overbinding mother, which create the gender disturbance, which is the core of homosexuality.
Instead of biblical scholars and research scientists, you go on interviewing ex-gay leaders and well-meaning Christian counselors. Pat, their ideas about homosexuality are about as up-to-date as leeches and lobotomies. And worse, you use ex-gays and ex-lesbians still in the process of discovering who they are to support your point, and you never even ask what happens to them later.
And the Lord delivered me out of an addiction to masturbation, an addiction to pornography, idolatry. I had over 400 sexual partners, and I am HIV negative only by the grace of God. And now the Lord has not only taken me out of homosexuality, I'm married for 10 years, and I have 2 children, where before I had no attraction to the opposite sex.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Him, you're right.
Pat, you ignore biblical scholarship, you ignore scientific evidence, you use data that can't be trusted, and you use people whose lives are still in process, all to support a bias that can no longer be supported. And in the meantime, families are divided, children are abandoned, and more lives are wasted.
How do people come out of this thing? Because how many people who are in the, quote, gay lifestyle have you helped in Operation Exit?
We estimate, upwards of 200,000 people in the last 20 years have contacted us.
Is that
we don't know all the, we haven't been able to follow them up over the last 20 years.
This ex-gay leader admits there's been no follow-up. They don't know what has happened to the people they have counseled, but we do know, because they end up, so many of them, in our churches when they can't hold on any longer. They come feeling broken and despairing, angry at God and angry at the church. They feel misled and misused. I know. I spent 30 years trying to be an ex-gay myself, praying, fasting, getting married, raising children, being counseled, going through aversive therapies, taking exorcism treatments, even electric shock. Finally, I discovered the hard way that you and the ex-gay movement are wrong about homosexuality, and that your information, no matter how well intended, cannot be trusted.
Homosexuals are observing today as National Coming Out Day, a time when so-called closet homosexuals are urged to openly announce their sexual preference. But a coalition of 35 Christian organizations has proclaimed today National Coming Out of Homosexuality Day instead. One of the organizers is Michael Johnson. He's a former homosexual now infected with HIV who has become a born-again Christian. Johnston says the other side of the story has to be told. He says many homosexuals are desperately lonely people, leading desperately lonely lives, being told that there is no way out but acceptance. And Johnson challenges the national media to expose what he calls the world of disease, despair, and decadence, which he says are the real consequences of gay pride.
To summarize our lives, my life, with those 3 words, disease, despair, and decadence, is despicable, Pat, and you should be ashamed. I march with pride in our pride parades, and I've seen your crews sneaking around, trying to get pictures of someone who will enrage or frighten your viewers, all the time missing the hundreds of thousands of marchers who look just like you and me. It isn't honest, Pat. It isn't ethical, and it certainly isn't news, and you do it over and over again.
It's not a question of denying anybody any rights. It's a question of giving special privileges to people on account of how they perform sex acts.
If you say you have special rights accorded to you by virtue of how your sexual preference, then where do you draw the line? I mean, at what point does something become off limits? Because as long as it's under the guise of my sexual preference, what can you say no to?
And the problem is nothing. I mean, somebody could be involved in pedophilia, bestiality, all kinds of sadomasochism, and none of it's off limits.
Including snuff films, if necessary.
All those things.
Pat, your campaign to convince 700 Club viewers that lesbian and gay Americans want special rights is as bogus as your newscasts. We don't want special rights. We only want the rights guaranteed us by the Constitution. And stop saying sexual preference, please. It's sexual orientation. Did you choose being heterosexual because you preferred it? And you and Ben should both be ashamed, comparing our sexual orientation to pedophilia, bestiality, and even snuff films? So it goes. More fear, more intolerance, more misinformation flowing out of Virginia Beach, toxic waste, polluting the environment, and almost always connected somehow with an appeal for money.
If the downward trend continues, Americans will soon find themselves totally surrounded by interactive perversion, held hostage by warped entertainment unimaginable even to today's jaded mentality. So far, the end is not in sight.
You may kiss the bride if there so be one. It doesn't.
Ladies and gentlemen, that is what is being shown on television today. We're not talking about the future. We're talking about now. And folks, you can do something about it. We have before us an opportunity to change. It's better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. And what we're asking you to do now is something that's relatively simple. We want you to join the 700 Club. It's a commitment of just 65 cents a day.
For a while you used the threat of gays in the military to raise funds, when all the time you knew that Pentagon and RAND Corporation studies demonstrate clearly that lesbians and gays serve with honor and courage in every branch and at every rank in the military. Then you moved on to the homosexual threat in Hollywood, when you knew all the time that gay men and lesbians have used their creative, God-given gifts to produce the very finest family entertainment. Now, you're raising money on the threat of same-sex marriage.
We talked earlier about recognizing homosexual marriages. For this cause shall a man leave his mother and father and cleave unto his wife, and the twain shall be one flesh. That is God's definition of marriage. Not for this cause shall a man leave his mother and father and cleave unto another man, or a woman leave her mother and father and cleave unto another woman. That it just is unbiblical, it's unscriptural. This council of rabbis and these churches that are saying we've got to acknowledge this, quote, loving relation. God says, I don't recognize it. And I'm for sticking with God.
This is not about marriage, Pat. It's about civil rights. Gary Nixon and I celebrated our 12th anniversary on Palm Sunday, 1996. We're a couple for life, and yet we have no shared legal rights. If he goes to a hospital, I can't even visit him because I am not legally his next of kin. We don't have the right to share tax returns or government benefits, or parental custody or joint property or health insurance. We can't share automatic inheritance rights, or even the right to make medical decisions for our partners if they're disabled. We are real, Pat, and our relationships are genuine. If you would let me, I could introduce you to gay and lesbian couples all across America, hundreds around Virginia Beach, who have celebrated 10, 20, 30, even 50 loving, committed years together. And yet not one of those couples shares in any of the 170 legal rights gained automatically by heterosexuals who marry. In spite of our obvious commitment to each other, in spite of the homes and the families we build together, in spite of our service to our community and the nation, the legal rights of marriage have been withheld from us. You condemn us because you think we're promiscuous. Then you condemn us again when we ask to share in the rights and responsibilities of marriage.
I am absolutely persuaded that one of the reasons so many lesbians are in the forefront of the pro-choice movement is because being a mother is the unique characteristic of womanhood, and these lesbians will never be mothers naturally, and so they don't want anybody else to have that privilege either.
Pat, you are so tragically misinformed. Here are some of the recent studies that prove that lesbians are among the finest mothers in the world, that their children grow up all the better for having them as mothers. Will you consider the data with me? And if you're wrong, will you apologize to the millions of lesbian Americans you have offended? Again, if you would let me, I could introduce you to hundreds of lesbian mothers in and around Virginia Beach who are single or who are in loving long-term relationships, raising healthy, happy children, committed to real family values. Will you spend an evening with lesbian moms and their kids? Will you invite them to appear on the 700 Club so that you and your viewers would be informed by truth? Are you interested in truth, Pat? The truth about gays and lesbians, about bisexual and transgendered people? You certainly don't seem interested in the truth about HIV or AIDS. And that disinterest leads to more suffering and to more death.
Homosexual leaders from around the nation got a special reception at the White House Wednesday. The group of about 50 homosexuals met with Vice President Al Gore and senior White House officials. But they were first greeted by some White House guards who had put on rubber gloves for the occasion. The guards reportedly were afraid of contracting the AIDS virus.
Keep those rubber gloves on, fellas. You don't have to get AIDS.
Your little comment reinforces at least two tragic errors. First, that gays and lesbians should be feared because they carry AIDS. And second, that the disease can be spread through casual contact. Both assumptions are untrue. Pat, if ever the world needed truth, it is now. Instead, you're using your powerful voice to spread deadly untruth. And worse, you are creating fear, distrust, and intolerance when the world needs compassion and understanding now more than ever before.
Today we take a personal look at the lives of homosexuals who are suffering the ultimate consequence of their behavior, the nightmare of AIDS. Joshua Ruiz, who you saw just then, died as a result of his homosexual behavior. If people begin these courses of conduct, God does not hesitate to bring judgments lest it spread. And obviously with homosexuality, it is bringing terrible disease on people. Not just AIDS, but many other forms of intestinal disease, various other types of so-called sexually transmitted disease.
This whole concept of safe sex is nonsense. There is no such thing as safe sex. The only safe sex is monogamous, heterosexual sex in marriage and abstinence outside of marriage. And this is promiscuity, and I don't care how it's practiced, there's no such thing as safety. And they are killing themselves at a rapid rate. It's a terrible tragedy, and we as a nation refuse to treat HIV and AIDS as a communicable disease. We treat it as a civil right, and it is outrageous.
Pat, we've collected hundreds of examples of this kind of tragic, thoughtless misinformation from your 700 Club. This kind of misinformation leads to suffering and even to death. You condemn gay men with AIDS for bringing the disease on themselves, but you never condemn your friends who die from lung cancer for smoking too much, or your friends with heart disease from eating too much and exercising too little. And you misuse the Bible to condemn us. Pat, the Bible has been misused to condemn those who stood against slavery, to condemn those who stood against child abuse, to condemn those who stood against the second-class citizenship of women. Now you're misusing it again to condemn God's lesbian and gay children. Pat, if you knew how many innocent gay men we've buried this past year who were murdered by people who bashed gays, who thought they were doing God and the country a favor, if you knew, you would understand why I take your false and inflammatory rhetoric so seriously. Pat, what if you are wrong about us? What will the consequences be for your soul and for the soul of America?
From a biblical standpoint, the rise of homosexuality is a sign that a society is in the last stages of decay.
There's not one shred of historical evidence that homosexuals cause societies to decay. Quite the opposite, Pat. Consider Sappho, the lesbian poet 6 centuries before Christ, or Alexander the Great's committed love to his general Hephaestion, or Michelangelo, or Leonard Bernstein. Come on, Pat. Your Family Channel wouldn't survive a day without the creativity of lesbians and gays in the film industry. Societies decay and die when intolerance, bigotry, and hatred divide a nation into warring camps, when leaders get greedy, when they don't care enough about the truth. Pat, you have become a primary international source of misinformation that leads to intolerance. And I promise you, in the spirit of the soul force principles of Gandhi and King, that we will bring the truth and love to you relentlessly until you finally get it. In our own different ways, we both follow Jesus, who said, "Know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Meet with us, Pat. Discuss these issues with us openly, honestly. Let's all have the courage, then, to follow truth wherever it leads us. But in the meantime, remember, we are listening.